I will talk, as my title says, about AI and neuroscience and about the bidirectional relationship between those extremely interesting disciplines. And so this is just part of the much larger community at IBM Research, where I'm coming from, where people are interested in work at the intersection between those two fields, some coming from AI background, some coming from neuroscience background. And this direction seems to be kind of benefiting, I think, both fields. I'll give a few examples of how AI is being applied to neuroscience, but also I'll try to kind of ask questions about how can we possibly use all this vast knowledge about human brain that neuroscience accumulated over decades and possibly come up with even better algorithms for learning and AI in general. So that's why I always like to draw this circle, which is bidirectional, showing how both disciplines can hopefully enrich each other. And I will briefly talk about the direction of AI for neuroscience first, just with a few examples out of many. I've given several talks about this in the past years and gave our prior examples. So here I'll just talk about the most recent ones, just a few of them. And hopefully, if the time permits, I'll give you examples of few algorithms that we came up with using, to some extent, inspirations about how brain works. So just to give a brief overview of several years of work in our group with various applications to different kind of neuroscientific domains, from chronic pain studies to schizophrenia, cocaine addiction, and beyond, I just wanted to summarize in this slide how successful applications of machine learning can be when you apply them, for example, to brain imaging data such as functional MRI, EEG, more lately calcium imaging, because you can use power of machine learning to go way beyond the state of art in neuroimaging, which currently uses more simplistic tools like traditionally used in the field. Machine learning has a lot to bring to this area. Just to name a few successful examples, we were quite surprised to see that, for example, you can very accurately predict such a subjective kind of perception as pain perception just based on the brain movie functional MRI data. You can quite accurately also detect certain mental states while people are playing video game. Not all of them, and it's actually an interesting question, what can or cannot be detected. But the list goes on because you keep analyzing different data sets and different applications, trying to see not only how accurately you can, say, detect mental state, but what are those features or patterns, or people in neuroscience would call them biomarkers. In this case, they are statistical biomarkers. What are those discriminative features that make all the difference between, say, a patient, schizophrenic patient at control, or what are differences in, say, sparse Markov network properties of cocaine addict versus control, and so on and so forth. So this is just a very high-level summary, but it's nice to see that machine learning can bring a lot to this field. Last but not least, of course, you can explore advances in deep learning and apply it to these data sets. But there are certain challenges, such as typically much smaller data than you would expect in the web data and so on. So you need to be a bit more inventive about how you can use deep learning in this area. You need to definitely apply smart regularization. You need to use domain knowledge. And I'll give a few examples of that. But the bottom line is that machine learning in the past decade showed us that it's possible to achieve quite remarkable successes in terms of capturing brain functioning in health and disease under multiple conditions. So let me actually give you just one recent example of the neuroimaging study that we kind of are working on. The paper is in submission right now. So this is actually an interesting recent technology which goes way beyond functional MRI and EEG in terms of very high resolution, both spatial and temporal. It's called calcium imaging. And well, unfortunately, or fortunately, calcium imaging is not done on people. That's why this is a picture of a larval zebrafish. So actually, you can Google it. It's on YouTube. You can find this video there. But the interesting thing here is it's a very detailed data about the brain activity of the living organism while kind of trying to do something. So the fish is supposedly trying to move, but it's being pinned, and it thinks it's moving, though it's kind of in place. In terms of neuroscience data collection, that was quite a breakthrough to be able to collect data at such a high combination of like spatial and temporal resolution. But the question is, how do you possibly capture very high dimensional dynamic data like this? What kind of models should you use? You obviously see, and we know from the many studies in neuroscience and various models used there, that brain often exhibits oscillatory behavior. The dimensionality of the data is humongous. So if you just apply LSTM on the raw data, it's probably not going to work well because you only have a few, maybe 100 samples. So the data are small. So what do you do? Like, how do you try to capture these dynamics? So here comes to the rescue the domain knowledge, and all that literature from neuroscience suggests that certain type of dynamical models, like, for example, van der Waals oscillator, might be useful to describe, at least at some level, brain activity. So we tried that. I will not go into all the details. I mean, there is an interpretation of observed variable x1 and its dynamics and the hidden variable x2. And the system is coupled, which is most interesting. So you have W matrix showing how the basically different brain regions and their activity are related. So if you learn such a model, you should be able not only to capture how brain evolves, but also to get interpretable results in forms of strengths of interaction between different brain areas. The problem is it's not something people usually learn in classical machine learning, and it's not really something that physicists who use van der Waals a lot do because they don't usually work with learning from massive data sets. It was somewhat non-trivial, but after working for a while with optimization folks and trying different style of expectation maximization and type of algorithms, we managed to combine like stochastic search for parameters with proper use of so-called variable projection optimization by our co-author Sasha Ravkin. We got pretty nice fit to the data, which was remarkable. It hadn't been actually achieved so far, but more interestingly, we also got some interpretable results showing how the different parts of the brain, or actually spatial components that we used here, are related to each other. But the next question is, how do you predict? That's the most interesting part. How do you predict the future evolution of brain activity? If you abstract from that brain, actually, you could use such approach for any high-dimensional, complex, coupled dynamical system, be it weather or stock market or you name it. Whenever you have multiple interacting variables, there is some hidden and observed activity. You could try to use this model. We unfortunately didn't see immediately that it predicted well, but we also tried the generic recurrent nets like LSTM and different flavors of them. At first, they didn't predict well either because, as I mentioned, the data were small. So this is a classical example of what we keep encountering in this domain: combination of some domain knowledge and or analytical model with general purpose heavy-duty, multi-parametric neural net is usually the best. And indeed, what happened here, we decided to augment LSTM with non-existent data. We only had like 500 time points that were actually simulated in unlimited amounts from the analytical model. So you fit analytical model to some extent to your training data. It may not predict well, but it captures something. Now you can simulate as much as you want in terms of your time series, and then it significantly improves performance of your LSTM. So neither one of those approaches by itself was achieving the best results. The combination, the hybrid was. So that's kind of one of the most kind of important and classical lessons in this domain of neuroimaging and application of machine learning to it. You need to combine both. Just blindly applying generic models may not be the best things. Anyway, just to kind of summarize that very brief overview of the neuroimaging exercises that we were doing, as I mentioned, there are several aspects that kind of make it special. Any biological domain, including neuroscience, will not benefit from statistical models that are black boxes, because you need to learn something about your subject or about what you're studying. Having sparse models, having models that can provide you with some interaction network is a key. That's why this last example was learning the coupling matrix, and coupling matrix was showing how positively or negatively and to what extent different brain areas affect each other in this kind of whole dynamical activity. As I already mentioned and keep repeating, domain knowledge is essential. I know that the whole premise of the learning representation and deep learning was to get rid of the step of feature extraction. And in some sense, we came really far beyond that in many applications, but it's still not completely out of the picture. And the good old machine learning folk wisdom that designing good features is everything, and if you succeed in designing good features, then any classifier will do, it still has a point. So this was a good example of a domain where you know so much about brain, well, maybe bits and pieces, but lots of them, that just throwing away all that knowledge and replacing it by completely automated and generic model is not the optimal way to go. On the other extreme, just using analytical models was not scalable either, so the hybrid, the combination of both, is the way to go, and there are many ways to combine them. I'm not going to talk about all examples, but using ideas from neuroscience knowledge to design features, using analytical models like Van der Pol oscillator to generate simulated data and augment training data set for LSTM, using various kind of domain-specific priors, are all examples of incorporating your domain knowledge and combining with powerful, large-scale neural network. As I mentioned, deep learning applied in this domain faces specific challenges, and small data is, I think, the biggest challenge. That's why you have to be smart about how do you make it work. With enough regularization and data augmentation and so on, it seemed to be possible, but that's something to keep in mind. If you just simply blindly throw off-the-shelf deep net tools on this data, they most likely not going to work. And as I mentioned, interpretability in those domains is as important as predictive accuracy, because your goal is not just to predict whether the person going to develop schizophrenia or not, but also to explain why you think so, and also hopefully find properties of their brain activity that are generic across multiple people and situations that tell you something about what went wrong. What's the difference between say, so-called normal brain and the brain which has a disorder. Anyway, those are several lessons that we kind of learned over the past years when trying to apply a variety of machine learning techniques in this domain. Another related topic, although it goes more towards psychology and psychiatry, which is still can be considered part of neuroscience, is a kind of second story I wanted to tell you. And this one is motivated by what people recently started calling crisis in psychiatric research and in psychiatric practice. And instead of making you read this whole long paragraph, which is from one of the survey papers by Michael Frank and his co-authors, I really like kind of the way they give those examples. What they're trying to say here is, even though in other fields, in other medical fields, you have tests, blood work, X-ray, and so on. So if the patient comes complaining, for example, about chest pain, the doctor will not prescribe Advil and tell the patient to come in a couple of weeks and see how it goes. And yet, that's mostly what happens in psychiatry. And one of the main reasons, as the field agrees, is that psychiatry at this point lacks objective measurements, such as, well, blood pressure in other fields or results of blood tests. Developing such measures and applying them in practice is a long-term goal of the field called computational psychiatry. It's like very hot, popular, emerging field right now, and the National Institute of Mental Health is really trying to push for that, to make psychiatry actual science. It's not easy. It's easier said than done, but that's seems to be the direction to go. So the functional MRI and EEG analysis that I didn't give examples of, but we were working on, and many other people, are examples of such measurements, but it's lots of hard work to find reliable measures and features of particular disorders. So it's work in progress. Also, there is lots of work going on in terms of finding patterns specific to disorder and progression of disorder in speech, in transcribed text, in facial expressions, as we would think those have lots of information about mental states and their changes. So that's all kind of relates to this field. Again, I don't have much time to talk about that, so I will focus on most recent work, which is another application of machine learning and AI to the field of psychiatry. And in this case, it actually tries to address the issue of the automated therapy. It's needless to say, I mean, there are quite scary numbers in terms of prediction of worldwide disability and life loss attributable to depression may become greater than for any other condition, including cancer, stroke, heart disease, accidents in war, by 2030. Well, that's supposedly prediction from World Health Organization. I hope they're wrong. But they definitely have a point that depression and other common mental disorders affect large proportion of population. And even in well-developed countries, you don't need to go to the third world, where it may be hard to access well-trained psychologists or psychiatrists. Even in New York City, if you try to schedule an appointment, you will need to wait maybe a few weeks at least, or something like that. And even if you see a psychiatrist once a week or once in 2 weeks, is definitely not enough to track mental state of the patient, which may be changing quite rapidly within a day or less. Bottom line, there is lots of research and applications and startups right now in this area of automated therapy. That's everyone would like to have, at least in addition to doctors. Of course, not replacing doctors, but it's hard since it requires not just understanding natural language, producing dialogue, but most importantly, understanding mental states, their changes, and how what the system produces affects those states. The systems I've seen so far, such as Voabot and so on, they're very promising, and it's great that people are working on that, but they're very limited. They mostly have pre-programmed set of answers. They ask patient or user, I kind of played with it myself, you start saying something like free text, and the system does not, of course, understand you. They just understand when you choose one of 3 options or something like that. So it's quite far from the ideal ultimate goal of semi-automated therapy. So we were recently playing with publicly available data sets. For example, this data coming from the Alexander Street company. The data set contains multiple therapy sessions, particularly, say, in depression. And this is just a snapshot of how the data might look like. It's one of the discussions between a particular patient and a therapist. There are interesting specifics of this type of dialogue. Usually a patient talks a lot, and paragraphs or few paragraphs, and then there is a short answer of the therapist, which in a sense makes it easier specific sub-problem of open-ended dialogue generation, which is hard to solve. It's shorter, and it's also of specific type. Most of the time, therapist tries to go along with the patient, kind of try to provide some support without saying too much, letting the person develop the train of thought. It's not the only mode of operation. Sometimes therapist has to change the train of thought, and kind of that's the tricky one. But in those situations, what you see is you're kind of trying, the therapist is trying to maximize coherence with what patient is saying and try not to interfere. You can also say that the therapist, abstractly speaking, may try to maximize mutual information between what he's saying and what the patient is saying. Another good thing about maximizing mutual information would be if you see what patient said, predicting what therapist should say will be easier. If you build representations of the text that allow those responses to be maximally informative about each other. What I'm getting to is that in this particular work, we try to build models which would generate hidden representations, not necessarily using classical dialogue generation tools, not using LSTM and so on. In this case, we were using basically hashing models. And I have no time to go into all the details. There are many ways to do that. But bottom line, for each text, you can, again, produce a hidden multidimensional vector. And there are many ways to do so. Hashing turned out to be successful in sense that it worked well with relatively small data sets. And the generic principle, as I mentioned here, was the patient says something, that's a patient's response. You learn how to map it into binary hash vector, and then you predict what the therapist should say in terms of, again, binary hash code. Then you separately generate the text from that hash code. So mutual information maximization was one possible principle to train such representation learning, and it turned out to be useful, at least in the cases when, as I said, data were scarce. We had only 40,000 samples of patient and therapist responses. Well, we took some publicly available dialogue generation systems from Montreal University, from Miller's group. They also compared it with a few other techniques used in the field. Evaluating dialogue generation is a hard problem. It's an open problem because whatever metrics people use, they don't necessarily always correspond to meaningful text generation. And of course, in many cases, our system wasn't doing well either, but in some, at least it was providing reasonable answers, while unfortunately, LSTM here just couldn't learn anything. Again, the data were small, so it was just going on in the loops. And even the VHRED, that system from that we tried from our colleagues in Montreal, well, they said from the beginning, guys, we don't think it's going to work on such a small data set. So that was the case when the hashing model with mutual information principle at least generated something reasonable. There were like several versions of that depending on what classifier you use to actually create the hash code. I'm not going into details, but the paper is actually on archive. Yeah, the patient says, I did lose 3 pounds. Did you notice that? And real therapist says, that's great. I did notice that. And the hash method says something reasonable. Yes, you did. Well, sounds good. Well, to help you with your diet is a little bit iffy, but at least it's somewhat relevant. And you can see what, unfortunately, the deep net systems did here. The worst part was that they kept generating meaningless responses and the same responses for pretty much all examples in the therapy session. Again, I mean, I shouldn't be beating deep nets here because they were not supposed to be able to learn from that 40,000 sample data set. But what if that's all you have and you want to make some sense of, so what I'm trying to say that it happened so that the hash code-based approach was much more effective with smaller data sets. This was a long conversation. You don't have to read it, but the patient basically was complaining about the difficulty of getting therapists and so on and so forth and how expensive it's going to be and so on. And then the yellow version, RKNN, again, we didn't mean that, and it just happened so they said, oh yeah, you never tried lithium. Like, well, forget therapists. It's not like the AI developed sense of humor. It's totally accidental, but it was fun to see. And again, unfortunately, yeah, something needs to be done with deep net dialog generation so it can handle small data sets and not produce meaningless answers of the same kind for all statements that patient make. Again, that's just work in progress, so I wouldn't overgeneralize it, but it was interesting. Well, this is, of course, grand vision. I'm not saying that IBM has a system doing that, and also it's good to see that, as I said, there are multiple startups trying to work in this space and kind of going towards that goal, and that's good because I think it's a useful field that ideally you would like to have on your smartphone or other devices a system that I guess can remind some of you who have seen that movie Her, well, Her. So the system that can track your text, speech, your facial expression, your possibly other actions during the day. Of course, there will be a big issue about the privacy and security of keeping this data safe and just for you and for your kind of use only. But since the system should be on 24/7 and it can detect what's going on and much finer time scale than therapists can do, that system could potentially serve as a kind of a addition to your human psychiatrist who takes care of you between the visits, who informs doctor. And if something is going on that the system thinks is likely to be unusual change in your behavior, maybe alert the doctor, alert your friends or something. And sometimes as easy as simple action of telling a person a joke if the system infers that from the speech, voice patterns and text of today's emails sounds like you're getting a bit down and it's been going on for several days and we don't want you to develop depression, maybe just start showing you jokes frequently between scheduling appointments with therapists, maybe sometimes quite effective. There are many things to explore. So anyway, that's kind of the futuristic slide, but I think it will get there and probably sooner than we think. Okay. So now I'm going to switch to the second part of my talk, although it looks like I have no time left. And over the remaining 8 or so slides, I'll probably have to go very quickly. But as I mentioned, there is bidirectional relationship between those both fields, which essentially focused on the same question. what is intelligence, how brain works. So they just look at that from very different angles. Now the question could be, if you use neuroscientific knowledge, can you come up with anything better than current algorithms? And in a sense, you can say, well, we're already using neuroscience. I mean, neural networks, by definition, were inspired by that, although everybody will agree that it's very far from how things are actually working in real life. So hopefully, if you make them a bit more aware of how this system works, maybe you can gain something for AI as well. And reinforcement learning is another classical example of using neuroscience inspirations to come up with quite effective AI. There are multiple things that are still not quite there with modern artificial systems, such as plasticity, neurogenesis, and so on. We're still kind of working under assumption that there is a training data set, and we will learn a model, and we'll stabilize its parameters, and we will apply it on test set, and it's not how the brain works. So if you do something a bit more plastic, online, continual, lifelong learning, where your model, say network, never stops adapting, and its complexity may increase and decrease, and it's not just weights that changing their values, but also topology and even existence of kind of neurons, like neurogenesis. If you add extra levels of flexibility, perhaps you're going to have much better continual learning algorithms, which is kind of all the hype in the field right now. How do we make models that can continue learning forever without forgetting what they learned before? There are other aspects that are not quite covered by modern deep learning as well. Attention and memory are working quite nicely, but if you look at actual attention and memory in the brain, they are very far from what we call attention and memory in machine learning. And as I mentioned before, brain is a dynamical system, highly complex, extremely high dimensional, highly coupled, but it's a dynamical system. And neural networks right now and machine learning models are not. They are kind of they're inherited from statistical way of viewing the world, that here is the data and here is a model, and that's the end of the story. So brain is only static when you're dead. If you're alive, it's a dynamical system. So if we can build neural nets that keep changing and basically keep adapting, that hopefully they will be more powerful as well. So this is, again, high-level vision that eventually, hopefully, if we take care of better modeling of those aspects of brain, such as plasticity, attention, memory, and reward processing, and motivation, and so on, hopefully we'll get at more powerful artificial systems. So current focus was on model adaptation. I don't have much time, but I just want to mention that phenomenon of adult neurogenesis inspired us to do lifelong learning with continuously changing architectures. And adult neurogenesis is an interesting phenomenon of new neurons being born in adult brains, which was not believed to be the case like 30 years ago, but now is well established in pretty much all mammals. There are mainly two areas, hippocampus and olfactory bulb in the rats and other mammals. In humans, it's harder to study, but it still seems to be that hippocampus is kind of mainly the place where it happens. And the gist of that neurogenetic kind of phenomenon seem to be from neuroscientific papers. It happens when animal or a person is exposed to rich, changing, challenging environment, where essentially you can say environment is non-stationary, then more neurogenesis is happening. So the story was, can we come up with a simple computational model of the process which would show computational advantages of neurogenesis in non-stationary environment? And as a second benefit, can we come up with a better kind of learning algorithm? And just kind of going briefly, if you use simple sparse coding or dictionary learning, which essentially is a sparse linear autoencoder, and you try to learn it online, there are methods from the past by Myral and others, which essentially are optimizations like sparse optimization methods. If you do that, but you augment them with neurogenesis, adding new hidden units when your prediction error drops, when you start performing badly, when your model does not predict well, you enrich it with more hidden units. And at the same time, to prevent that artificial brain from exploding, you have to control for the size, so you have to kill some cells or hidden units that you're not being that particularly useful. So you have group sparsity to do that. If you combine the birth and death of hidden units, as you go over changing data, and you test it in some environments, for example, where the domain goes from images of city, like buildings and so on, to nature, or vice versa, to make long story short, adaptive neurogenetic model not only adapts and kind of predicts better, but it also seems to remember better the past as compared to similar size but fixed model that didn't go through these cycles of expansion and compression. So that was kind of a validation of neurogenesis phenomenon in brain. And I understand you probably could have come up with this model without neuroscience, but it was interesting that we started thinking about this network architecture adaptation in continuous non-stationary setting because of neuroscience colleagues who wanted us to think about this phenomenon. Anyway, recent work, probably I'll try to finish in 30 seconds if I can, is extending these approaches to arbitrary deep nets. And essentially, if you look at the fully connected feed-forward network, it's just a deterministic based net. And what you're trying to optimize is just maximum likelihood here. But you can actually relax activations to be truly noisy instead of being deterministic functions. And the objective will be the one shown at the bottom. The loss function is, say, multinomial loss. And the noisy parts are those quadratic losses between what the activation should have been and what they actually are. If you optimize this using EM-style approaches, alternating minimization with activation variables being explicitly treated as variables, not just weights, that's going to be the main difference between such approaches and backpropagation. Backpropagation simply optimizes for weights as if activations or neurons were deterministic functions. They are not, they're noisy. So EM or alternating minimization treats them explicitly, optimizes for them explicitly. So you don't have problem of vanishing gradients anymore because the chain of gradients is now broken and only local optimization is left. Non-differentiable functions might be treated in easier way, again, because of local optimization. And you can potentially optimize, and not just us, people have shown it in the past several years. Alternating minimization methods allow you to perform weight updates in parallel, so you can gain some speed here. It's somewhat more biologically plausible for several reasons that I'm not going to mention now, and specific way of doing this involves the same type of covariances and cross-covariance matrices, quote-unquote memory, that we used and piggybacked on in the sparse coding and dictionary learning. So it's all on archive, and the idea is quite simple, but preliminary results are promising. I'm not showing results on 100-layer ResNet yet. We're working on that. But using like up to 5-layer DeepNet, comparing backpropagation versus alternating minimization, we get similar results, say, on MNIST eventually, but alternating minimization seems to learn faster. So it outperforms backpropagation in the small data regime in the beginning. So it kind of learns faster, then stabilizes, backprop catches with that. CFAR, similarly, depends on architecture, depends on many things. So bottom line, it has certain advantages, plus it behaves as good as, or sometimes better, than actually ADAM, SGD, particularly ADAM, for backprop. Also, it definitely outperforms a few state-of-art alternating minimizations that were working offline. This is online approach. This is approach for continual learning. Anyway, so I probably don't have much time to talk about, and it's only one slide, yet another kind of direction of research, which is attention, but in general in decision-making, in online decision-making, reinforcement learning, bandit problems, where the input set of features is not necessarily given to you and you just have to select, like in classical attention. But it's costly to even observe them. Imagine you have 100 possible tests that you can perform on a patient, but you're only allowed to do 3 because of cost and time constraints. How do you learn where to pay attention? So that's a bit more realistic setting, just like with visual attention. Nobody gives you environment as a fixed given set of pixels. It's in a sense infinite, and yet you have to learn to pay attention and select subset of features without the possibility of ever having the full list of features available to you. So this is last year Rich Kai paper on bandit with attention. Anyway, so I'm, I think, considerably over time. I apologize, but a few lessons we learned from both applying AI to neuroscience, as I mentioned, and from trying to apply neuroscience to AI. The second seemed to be much more challenging than the first because it's quite open-ended, and there is a huge gap between nitty-gritty details of how brain works, what neuroscientists seems to kind of accumulated tons of knowledge about, and how does this possibly connect and can benefit AI researchers. That's up to AI researchers, I guess, to figure out what questions to ask and what to tease out from neuroscience. But for that, you need to kind of learn more about neuroscience. Thank you.